Speech of the day, right? So I thought to try to smooth the transition from into the cocktail reception, we'd play a game of high-stakes innovation beer pong. Any volunteers? Just kidding. I'm going to do one better, actually. I'm going to show you all a magic trick. So, got 3 cups here, 3 ordinary cups. I'm going to pour some water into one of them. And ever so expertly mix them around and ask you, the audience, to try to remember which is the cup with the water. Anyone? This one? This one? No. This one? I didn't even say abracadabra. What happened? Well, for those that don't know this trick, the secret is, actually, before I started, I took some super absorbent polymer, poured it into the cup, and put the water in it, turned it into a gel. So at this point, maybe you're asking yourself, Ross, why are you so obsessed with super absorbent polymer? Are you a magician? I'll let the audience decide whether I might have a budding alternative career path here. But the truth is, just like my colleague Sarah, and I'm sure many of you in the audience, I get inspiration from my kids. And I am lucky enough to be the dad of 2 beautiful daughters. Chloe's 3, Olivia is going to be 7 weeks tomorrow. And we got a lot of diapers in our house. My garage is full of them. I got one right here. It's clean, I promise. No more poop jokes. That's not the direction that's going. But it's probably the most critical product to our daily family operation, right? And a lot of you might think of a diaper as kind of a mundane product, but it's actually a compilation of some pretty interesting chemistry and performance materials, right? So you've got the core ingredient, the superabsorbent polymer, right? So over time, this has allowed diapers to get a lot thinner, last longer. You've got adhesives, right, on the tabs. Can you hear? Yep, you got the adhesives, make it a lot more convenient to put them on, take them off. And you've got elastomers, right, as well, legs, waist. So really improve the fit and the performance even more. Yeah, well, over time, materials innovations have significantly, improved the design of the diaper. And you can see, just from the simple analogy that by converting materials, right, to products, it's critical whether you happen to be a developer of a material technology or a product technology. And this is an important point I'm going to keep circling back to throughout this talk, right? Materials technologies enable products, but they are not the same thing, okay? So, sounds obvious, I know. But again and again, through history, we've seen that translating the performance and the value proposition from a material form factor to a final part is actually very difficult and often overlooked, right? I mean, all we have to do is take a look at some of the last few generations of advanced material technologies and compare kind of the hype based on the purported potential of the material from its performance in a lab with use cases that just never materialized and, in retrospect, seem kind of ridiculous. And fair to say that, this challenge is only going to get more complex as the innovation potential of materials rise, right? So if you think of kind of like multifunctional nanomaterials, nanocrystalline cellulose is kind of the poster children for this mismatch between material hype and commercial product reality. Next generations of materials that enable dynamic rather than just static functionality, smart materials, metamaterials that allow the achievement of properties not just from chemical composition but from physical microstructure and surface texture, we're going to further raise the innovation potential, which makes this commercialization argument so much more complex, right? And as we know, materials are critical for disruption across industries, right? Whether we're talking about lighter weight composites and metals, cleaner catalysts, better batteries for more efficient transportation. stiffer structural materials, more wear and corrosion-resistant surfaces for improving our energy generation, or in our consumer products, more scratch-resistant and flexible displays, better barrier materials to preserve freshness and improve biodegradability. Whoever you are, whatever industry or value chain you're in, you have a stake in improving, leveraging materials performance and translating that into commercial success, right? So what are we going to do? Well, first, I thought it'd be instructive to take a look at what we've already done. So Lux has long advocated for material developers to move down the value chain, right? Move down the value chain, reduce your revenue potential, your profit margins, reduce product integration complexities, particularly for nanomaterials, reduce potential environmental health and safety concerns. And fair to say, this has led to some modest initial successes. We've seen graphene film developers finally mostly give up going after large area sheets, move down the value chain, developing sensor products. The more successful metamaterial developers don't actually market themselves as advanced materials companies, but rather as solution providers for things like adhesives, antimicrobial films. And consistently, the most successful carbon nanomaterial developers are the ones who have moved down the value chain, developing sheet, tape, yarn form factors, right? But I purposely use the word modest success here because it's all kind of relative, right? I mean, the bar for success has not been that high. And on the flip side, these strategies have also led to some kind of ridiculous and really just marketing-focused products. So Cybex Technologies. At one time, I would have called them one of the leading nanocomposite developers back in 2010. They built themselves an unmanned surface vessel made of carbon nanotube reinforced carbon fiber prepreg. So a product that, other than the most niche military customer, next to nobody needs, created some nice marketing buzz at the time, but their revenue's been flat the last 6 years. The head graphene next tennis racket, you can see what they're getting at here, right? Kind of a nifty marketing strategy, but I remain really skeptical that there's more than any kind of negligible amount of graphene in here to have any significant performance impact. And probably my most recent favorite example, Bolt Threads. Spider Silk developer, just a couple weeks ago actually, they released their first product, a Spider Silk necktie. And I'm just going to read the quote here because I think it's quite illuminating. The company, which has raised some $90 million in venture capital funding, calls the tie the product of more than 200 person years of research and design, right? So, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a gorgeous tie. I wish I was wearing this tie. But 90 million, 200 person years, and you've got a tie? I mean, we're not really talking about the biggest market opportunity. And seriously, in all seriousness, I think what's most disappointing here, and really kind of epitomizes this whole disconnect, is that this tie does not even leverage the performance properties that got everyone excited about Spider Silk in the first place. It's just kind of a marketing cop-out. And fair to say, we can broaden this too. These struggles of moving down the value chain, certainly not unique to the realm of startups. Large chemical and material companies are also struggling with this, right? I mean, as many of you in the audience know, significant market pressure right now under chemical materials companies. Big oil starting to move downstream, the move to specialties, becoming less attractive. What better case study than the largest chemical and material company in the world, BASF, right? This data actually was put together by Lux's corporate strategic intelligence team, and you can see, comparing the profitability of BASF's operating segments, its specialty businesses actually have lower profitability than its commodity chemicals. So, you know, I submit, and I think that we really need to start rethinking the relationship between materials, products, and markets. So, as we rethink this framework, let's start with what we already know, right? This classic trade-off between materials push and market pull, okay? So, materials push, allure here, you've got these platform materials, all these great applications, they're going to leverage all these different properties, right? But what have we seen throughout, history again and again? Something that is purported to be great at everything ends up being concretely good at nothing. Nothing. Okay? But on the flip side, I would also submit to you that solely relying on a market pull strategy is also not the answer, right? We might get some incremental successes, but at the expense, probably, of the most step change disruptions. So the question I would pose is, can we have the best of both worlds? Can we maintain the disruptive potential of technology push, but with swifter commercialization timelines more resembling market pull? So to spoil the suspense for the rest of the talk, the answer is yes. I believe the answer is absolutely yes. And what I'm going to show you and elaborate on for the rest of this talk is how emerging materials, design, and manufacturing tools are actually integrating the material, the product, and production phases of the value chain so that they're no longer separate functions, but actually act as an integrated and continuous feedback loop. So how is that possible? How's it going to happen? All right. Well, let's first map out how we get from a material to a market. Right. The first phase, of course, are design tools, where we need to transition from a material technology, like superabsorbent polymer in a lab, to a product. Okay. And what's been really interesting is that over the past few years, we've seen a real explosion of hardware and software technologies aimed at really accelerating this material to product transition, okay? One of the most exciting and fastest moving is materials informatics, which uses data science and artificial intelligence methods to extract insights from existing materials and discover new materials. Leading player in the space, Silicon Valley-based Citron Informatics. They're working with the likes of Hyundai, Alcoa, Panasonic, and reported up to 2 times shorter R&D cycles using materials informatics. Moving down the value chain just a click, we have part design software, like multi-scale modeling and simulation tools. An interesting developer here is Finland's VTT ProperTune. They're working with an elevator manufacturer, elevator components manufacturer, Cone. And essentially what Cone's doing is they're setting the wear requirements for their elevator components, and then they're calculating the optimal product and materials composition and geometry to fit that product goal. And they've reported that it can save product development time by up to 50%. And finally, probably the design and rapid prototyping tool that's most familiar to everybody is 3D printing, which of course additively builds up objects from a digital model. And you also have 3D scanning, which essentially generates a digital model from a physical object. One company that's really demonstrated both the cost and time-saving benefits of 3D printing is Boston-based Markforged. Unilever has been using their composite 3D printers to save both cost and time for replacement parts for sensor mounts and fixtures on their factory floors. So you can see, as we start to integrate the material and the product phases of the value chain, we get improvements in performance, we get reductions in cost, and we get a more accelerated timeline to market, to product. So what's the next step, right? We got a product. We need to ensure we have an effective and efficient manufacturing process to make it at scale. So first technology I'll talk about is additive manufacturing, which is really just the terminology used to talk about 3D printing used in a manufacturing environment. Many of you might think of 3D printing, it's best suited to smaller volume production runs. Historically, that's been true. There's a lot of developers out there trying to change this. One in particular to call out is Additive. I believe they're based in Connecticut, and they're working on scalable metal 3D printing processes. Next year, they're targeting aerospace production runs of 1,200 parts and already have 6 confirmed customers. I believe Additive might actually be in the audience. If you're here, you can raise your hand right back there. People can find you during the reception if they want. So in complement to this additive manufacturing hardware, we also have software control systems like equipment control software, process simulation software, which improves the speed and efficiency of manufacturing operations, saving time, improving utilization of labor and materials, improving quality and consistency. A really interesting startup in this space is Authentize. They have what they call a manufacturing execution system. And it uses real-time equipment data, machine analytics, and they're focusing on moving additive manufacturing operations from a lab scale to a production scale. And finally, automated equipment and robotics technologies are becoming increasingly prevalent in construction and infrastructure applications where they improve efficiency and stability. A really interesting company here China's Shanghai wind soon. So what they're doing is they're using a robotic arm to 3D print prefabricated wall components, and then they're going ahead and assembling them on site. Right? So if we put this all together, you can start to see how these new design and manufacturing tools are integrating the value chain into a continuous feedback loop. Right? And because these are not materials technologies per se, they're more aptly platform tools. They enable technology push disruptive potential with market pull commercialization dynamics. So think about it. You've got software tools that allow you the setting of goals, product performance goals for your materials and your products that were previously unattainable, but you can leverage the computing power of the software to help you solve. Right? And complement to that, as I've gone over, you have new manufacturing hardware technologies which allow the fabrication of products with compositions, performance gradients, geometries, production economics that were just not possible through traditional manufacturing means. And just as importantly, because the end goal, right, because the key metrics of the end product and market were inherent in the development and production phases, there should be much swifter commercialization dynamics. Right? So hopefully it goes without saying at this point, but this is going to reshape, these materials design and manufacturing tools are going to reshape the path to market for new materials and products across industries. Whether you're a chemical and material company, whether you're a part manufacturer, whether you're an end user in whatever industry, if you are not developing your strategy now to incorporate these tools, you are going to get left behind. So how are you going to do it? Right? How are we going to maximize the value of leveraging these materials design and manufacturing tools? So first I thought it'd be illuminating to start with an example of what not to do. All right? So a bit of a history lesson of 3D printing. Why is it that two companies that many of you would probably call the once leading players in the 3D printing space, 3D Systems and Stratasys, why is it that they lost over 80% of their market value in the last couple of years, right? So I kind of already gave it away, right? Bad business models. So if we look back, these companies from the beginning employed, what many would call a printer cartridge or a razor blade business model. They sold you their printer hardware, but they forced you to buy their own branded materials, which they sold at a very high markup, right? So in the short term, when 3D printing was really dominated by prototyping, you can kind of squint your eyes and see, yeah, okay, this was a decent short-term model. They actually ended up making more money from consumable sales than they did from hardware. But I'd also say that this strategy was also pretty darn short-sighted, because the big elephant in the room, the big market opportunity in 3D printing has always been manufacturing of end-use parts, right? And by kind of denying a wider swath of materials expertise and selection to enter the market and not focusing on these manufacturing metrics, they really not only hurt themselves, but I would also argue held back the entire 3D printing space. And it hasn't been until over the past couple of years where we've seen a real influx of new developers working on new printing tools, new printable metals, printable polymers, and even service bureaus working on new process expertise. It's these new companies with new technologies with an open business model that's helped really accelerate the development of 3D printing, get it over the hump, and where it is today, where it's on the cusp of, and frankly, even in some manufacturing parts. And I think a really interesting, perhaps not intuitive foil to Stratasys and 3D Systems in the 3D printing space is Autodesk. Right? You might not traditionally think of Autodesk as a hardware company, but actually back in 2015, they released their own 3D printer called the Ember. It was a stereolithography printer, completely open source. The hardware, software, electronics, and most novel at the time, even the resin formulation was open source. Because it was open, it allowed third parties to come in, to tinker, to iterate, to improve the resin, control over the curing, the print speed, right? And you can see how Autodesk was really playing the long game here, right? Because instead of just narrowly focusing on their own slice of the pie, they focused on growing the overall space and in the long term boosting their software sales, which has really always been their core offering. So if we go back to our integrated ecosystem, we can start to see how it requires open innovation strategy to maximize success. Right? As I've alluded to before, materials development, product design, production, these are no longer separate functions. They're never going to be separate functions again. We'd be best served, right, leveraging our own core expertise, but at the same time aggressively looking for partners in this ecosystem that perform complementary tasks better than you. And as we've seen, those clinging to these outdated models are inevitably going to get left behind. Right? And I think a really good case study of this is the aerospace industry, where over the past 5 years, GE Aviation has built up a real leadership position in metal 3D printing. Back in 2012, even before 3D printing became kind of the next it thing, GE Aviation was already working on acquisitions. They acquired, at the time, 2 leading service bureaus, Morris Technologies and Rapid Quality Manufacturing. And just last year, they acquired what I would have called 2 of the leading metal 3D printing companies in the world in Concept Laser and Arcam. In addition to that, back in 2013, they did something pretty novel at the time. They held an open design competition, redesigning an engine bracket to reduce weight and maintain performance. Ended up getting hundreds of submissions, interestingly, many of which, including the winner, had no previous aviation experience. Last year, GE broadened its open design efforts, launched the Fuse platform along with Local Motors. This was aimed at crowdsourcing solutions to innovation challenges. GE claims this is going to reduce product development time by 50%. So put this all together, it's no surprise that GE was the first aerospace company to launch FAA-certified production parts for their jet engines, sensor housing, and fuel nozzles. So you can see how, on the one hand, leveraging these materials design and manufacturing tools, but combining that with an open innovation strategy really helped GE race ahead to a leadership position in the aerospace industry. But I'd also want to stress that these dynamics certainly not unique to the high-performance side of the spectrum. They're actually applicable across industries, across applications, no matter high volume or cost sensitive. A really interesting example here is actually the construction industry, where building information modeling, or BIM, is becoming crucial to the integration of new technologies. So my colleague Mike Holman this morning touched on this, but just for those that might not be familiar, essentially BIM, it's an integrated database of all information pertaining to a building, from materials data, cost data, design, project planning analysis, and it's becoming critical for material developers to list their materials data in the BIM so that architects and engineers can simulate performance and cost. As my colleague Gerald Wong, who's led a lot of Lux's construction analyses, would say, it's as if your material's not in the BIM, it's like it doesn't even exist, because it's not there for the architects and engineers to simulate and integrate with the rest of the building. But for those that do list it, for those that kind of share this openly, it allows for direct feedback to improve future R&D efforts, and even better, optimize how the materials integrate with the other parts of the building as well, right? So looking at chemical and materials players a little more broadly, as I touched on earlier, materials informatics really has quite a lot of potential to both accelerate R&D and help with discovery of new materials, right? But the quality and the quantity of the data is just so critical for training the machine learning algorithms, right? And chemical materials players, obviously you all sit on quite a wealth of data, things like composition, property, processing relationships. And I would encourage you to think about, partnering with and sharing such data with some of the leading developers in this space, many of which actually have service-based business models. I believe Newtonian and Lumient actually might be in the audience. If y'all are out here, you can raise your hand. People can find you. There. Great. So I could certainly go on, right? I could go over further instructive case studies for other industries like oil and gas, automotive, medical, consumer products. But for the sake of time, I would just want to reiterate that this is happening, right? And it would be best for all of us to consider both the implications and opportunities of these materials design and manufacturing tools. So I'm going to leave you with 5, okay? 5 that I think are applicable across industries. First, service-based business models are going to thrive, right? They make it easier to partner and work with some of the partners in your ecosystem that might perform complementary tasks better than you, or that you want to bring in. This data actually comes from Lux's materials design and manufacturing team. Over 80 companies we spoke with over the past year. You can see that those with service-based business models, despite having lower average technology score, actually perform better on commercialization metrics like commercial momentum, partnerships, and overall Lux take. A really high-profile example of this is the startup Carbon 3D. Carbon, actually known now, many of you might still know them as Carbon 3D. A couple years back, they launched their M1 printer to quite a lot of fanfare, gotten over $200 million in funding. At Lux, we remain still a bit skeptical on how game-changing their technology actually is. But we've been pretty impressed by their business model. They have a leasing business model, which is pretty novel for the 3D printing space. And you know, it's pretty interesting in terms of removing upfront cost barriers for using 3D printing and generating short-term revenues for Carbon. Number two, there continues to be tremendous opportunity for materials innovations in additive manufacturing. You know, first, of course, widening the selection of materials that can be printed. There's many developers working on this. One, again, Additive 3D, I believe you're in the audience right over there. They're working on printable thermosets for production scale parts. In addition to widening the selection of types of materials that can be printed, new form factors that can actually reduce costs. So instead of metal powders, where it requires very precise control over the morphology and the size distribution, trying out metal wires instead. Similarly, on the thermoplastic side, folks are working on pellets instead of just filaments, so ways to reduce, essentially, printable materials costs to make the economics of 3D printing more attractive for a wider swath of use cases. And of course, recycling, finding ways to recycle waste metal, waste plastic into a printable feedstock as 3D printing becomes really on all kinds of factory and pilot line floors, an on-site kind of recycling operation that turns these back into printable feedstocks is really valuable, and there's a lot of developers already working on this. Okay, 3. Designing parts for additive manufacturing is truly disruptive, right? So just to reiterate, additive manufacturing allows for novel kinds of compositions, performance gradients, geometries that are just not possible through traditional manufacturing. And by designing parts that are intended to be additively manufactured, we're really, best leveraging and maximizing this design space. One more company, I believe you're in the audience as well, N-Topology. Anybody out there? All right, maybe in the back. I believe they're here. They are also working on this. They've got some design software that enables property gradients to be engineered into parts. And kind of related to this design point is this fourth point, which I would call the democratization of software, which maximizes open design benefits. Think about it. If we're advocating open design, we want to maximize the swath of the population that can actually use the design tool so we can maximize this crowdsourced potential. So MIT's Foundry, they're doing some really interesting things with design software to design complex multi-material structures. But I think one of the particularly fascinating things that they focused on for this software is they're making a very user-friendly graphical user interface, such that non-experts, non-programmers can actually use this. All right? And finally, finding ways to leverage 3D scanning. Again, 3D scanning is essentially a way to reverse engineer objects into digital models. And you can see, if you think about it, how this can really find ways to simplify and augment value chains. So one developer who's working on this in more of an industrial setting is Zartec. So essentially what they're doing, they're scanning broken parts, matching that with a database of CAD files, and using that to accelerate the time for replacing broken parts and lowering the very costly downtime. There's even companies working on this in different kinds of consumer applications, essentially having 3D scanners in stores and situations where you'd want to scan and optimize fits for certain parts of the body, fitting eyewear, customizing orthotic insoles, things like that. All right, so I know covered quite a lot of ground in this talk, so I'm going to keep these conclusions short and sweet. All right, so to reiterate, hopefully it's clear at this point, materials enable products. They are not the same thing. We need to stop conflating initial success and potential of a material in a lab with a true product with a value proposition. Otherwise, we're just going to keep repeating history, and not learning the lessons, and not fully leverage the potential of advanced material technologies. 2, design and manufacturing tools both raise the disruptive potential of materials technologies, and at the same time, they also enable accelerated commercialization timelines. Right? And we need to keep in mind that the material, the product, and the production phases are no longer separate, but integrated into a continuous feedback loop. In order to maximize success in this ecosystem, we need to apply open innovation strategy and thinking. Right? And if there's one thought I can leave you with, it's that act now, right? Or in diaper parlance, y'all gonna be in deep shit, right? Sorry, I lied. I had to get one poop reference in there. But in all seriousness, because these new tools are accelerating commercialization timelines, if you don't act now, right, you really risk falling behind competitors and more nimble upstarts who are moving faster and smarter than you are. So thank you very much. Be happy to take any questions.